Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. You can tell I'm in a slightly different setting than I normally am. I am down in Southern Virginia on a week of study break. My church very kindly gives me time each year just to pull away for more focused and intense work. So I'm on my own, enjoying a warm fire on a cold winter night here, and have been spending the day studying and praying. And specifically what I've been kind of focusing on in my studies this year is the subject of covenant theology. Our church is actually going to be going through a study of covenant theology and then baptism flowing from that this spring. So we're about to start that in a couple of weeks, and looking forward to that, and thought that it would be a good use of my time to take the opportunity on this study break to do a deeper dive into covenant theology, to go back and read some of the works that have really articulated this historically, and to just kind of dig more into those things. So there may be a few reviews here coming out as I read different books on covenant theology, but I want to share my review on a very short but very important work written by the 16th century reformer Heinrich Bullinger. This is called A Brief Exposition of the One and Eternal Testament or Covenant of God. And you can see I'm just reading a PDF here. This is found at the end of this edition that I'm reading is translated by Charles McCoy and Wayne Baker. It was part of their book, The Fountainhead of Federalism, and they published this work by Bullinger at the end of that book. But the PDF is available online. So I'll try to post a link to the PDF in the description of this YouTube video. I found it helpful. It's well translated. They've got good footnotes where they're interacting with things and giving you context and sources for stuff. The only critique I have of the PDF that I'll just make you aware of, because it threw me off, as you're reading through, it jumps from page 107 to page 110. And then you read page 107, page 110, page 111, and then it goes back to page 108, 109, and then you're back at 112. So as you're reading, just keep your eyes open and you can kind of move back and forth, but that will throw you off otherwise. So anyways, but why did I pick this book out of all the books I could read on covenant theology? Well, I wanted to read Bullinger on this, not only because he was a significant reformer in his own right. He took over for Zwingli after Zwingli's death as the kind of leader of the Reformation in Zurich. But Bullinger's book here, A Brief Exposition of the One and Eternal Testament or Covenant of God, is often viewed as the first Reformed work on covenant theology. So it has a significance in terms of when it was written. So not only the content that it has, but the context of it is fascinating. We're getting to hear from one of the leading lights of the Reformation on one of the doctrines that's come to be associated very closely with especially the Reformed wing or branch of the Reformation. For a variety of reasons, Lutheran theology doesn't really do a whole lot with covenant theology, but the Reformers do. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize, because if you've heard about covenant theology today, it's probably been from a Reformed church or context. I pastor Catoctin Covenant Presbyterian Church, right? We make a big deal about covenant theology, and sometimes people have the idea, both proponents of covenant theology and critics of covenant theology, that covenant theology is something that the Reformed Church has invented or developed. And you'll even get some people who will point back to people like Bullinger, or sometimes people will point to someone like Coxeus or whoever and say, okay, they're the father of covenant theology. And there may be a sense in which it's helpful or accurate to talk about some of these Reformed and figures as being fathers in our understanding of covenant theology. But if what we mean by that is that they came up with the idea of covenant theology, then we're missing the boat. Because when you read Bullinger, one of the things that he's going to do is really try to root his understanding of covenant theology in the scriptures itself. He's making an exegetical argument. And secondly, he's going to be showing and arguing that what he's advocating, what he's teaching, is in its substance carrying on what the early church itself taught. So in this short work, he interacts a good bit with Augustine, and also interacts and references Tertullian and Irenaeus and some others as well. So he's trying to show that what he and other reformers are teaching in terms of covenant and gospel is not something new. It's something that was present ultimately in the scriptures, and then flowing out of that, the testimony of the early church. But what Bullinger is doing in this short work is trying to just provide a kind of short, accessible entry point, a brief exposition, as he says, of the one and eternal covenant of God. So the book as a whole, the work as a whole, is only about 40 pages long. I read it in one sitting and really enjoyed it. I don't think I've had the chance to read Bullinger before. I have his Reformation Heritage books recently republished, his Decades, which is kind of his biggest, most well-known work. And so I'm looking forward to getting into that at some point, but I haven't read it yet. After reading this little work, I'm even more excited to do it, because Bullinger has proved to be a very good writer, very lucid, very clear, and very much accessible to read. That's not always the case when you're going back 400 years and reading, or 500 years in this case, getting closer to that works, but it was the case here. This work was written in 1534, I should say, so very early on in the work of Reformation. This was published 2 years before Calvin would have published the first edition of his Institute. So again, very important work in understanding the Reformed teaching of covenant. So Bullinger is trying to give a brief exposition of this. One of the things in the background, of course, is he did take over for Zwingli. He is ministering in Zurich, which was one of the places where the Anabaptists first started. And so that's something that's very much in the background. And in the mid-1530s, when he's writing this, the Anabaptists are viewed as a threat by not only Reformed theologians, but really Protestants and Catholics who aren't Anabaptist. So there was a lot of concern about where their theology would lead, some of the ways it had been applied. I won't get into all that history now, but part of what Bullinger is trying to do is to address some of the criticisms that the Anabaptists had raised against, again, what he sees as being kind of historic Catholic, small c, Catholic teaching. So he's trying to address that, but he's also trying proactively to just give a brief exposition of covenant theology. So he starts by talking about, well, what is a covenant? And he goes through the Greek and Hebrew terms. He talks about the common Latin terms that were used at that point in time, and tries to lay out a kind of a definition of what a covenant is and how it should be understood. This is where having read a digital copy instead of a print copy doesn't serve me well, because it's hard for me to go back and find my notes and summaries of this. But he goes through those kind of biblical terminology and then talks about the different parts of a covenant. And he's rooting this somewhat in just the practice of covenants, contracts, agreements, relationships. Pacts is a term that he likes to use that would have been common in human society. And he says what God is doing when he's entering into a covenant, in part, is he's recognizing this is something that people were doing themselves and are recognizing, and so he's adapting that for his own purposes of redemption. And biblically speaking, Bullinger really begins his discussion of covenant theology with Genesis 17, God's covenant with Abraham. Now that's something that those who have studied covenant theology will recognize is different than later Reformed theologians will do. Later Reformed theologians will make a big deal about the covenant of works, the covenant that God makes with Adam. That term covenant is not used, which may be why Bullinger doesn't start there, but it has all the marks of a covenant, and in fact functions very importantly if we're going to understand, what Paul is doing in places like 1 Corinthians 15 or Romans 5, with the contrast and relationship between Adam and Christ. All of that is covenantal in its thinking and framework. Bullinger doesn't begin, though, with the covenant of works. He begins with the Abrahamic covenant, and I don't know if that's because he would not see God's relationship with Adam as being a covenant. That might be one reason. Or it could be that he's just giving a brief exposition again, and he's trying to get into the covenant of grace that God has and redemption. I haven't read enough of Bullinger's works to know how he handles God's dealings with Adam. So maybe someone in the comments can share more of Bullinger's views if you know more than I do on that point. But his focus, again, is on God's covenant of grace, to use our categories. And so he begins with Abraham, and then he walks through the promises that God made and the conditions that he gave and the duties and all of that are laid out. And then he really develops how what God was doing with Abraham is something that we then begin to see fulfilled and extended as God's covenantal dealings continue through Moses and into the new covenant and so forth. So again, there are certain things that are common to talk about in covenant theology today, the covenant of works, the covenant of redemption, God's covenant with David, that don't really get mentioned or addressed in this brief exposition. That may be because those were not things that were on Bullinger's radar screen. It may be because he just wasn't going to take the time to go through all of those steps. He's dealing with broad strokes and big categories here. And so he really roots us in what God is doing with Abraham in announcing the covenant of grace, formally instituting it, and then showing how what we have in the new covenant, what we have in the New Testament, what we have in the church is not something other than what God was doing in the Old Testament, but that there's a unity there. You get that again, even in the title of his work. He wants to give a brief exposition of the one and eternal testament or covenant of God. And so that's what he'll spend a lot of time developing, is the unity that exists between Old and New Testaments, the unity that exists between God's people in the Old Covenant and his people in the New Covenant. And so he'll talk about that, about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as being models for Christians. And he argues if the New Testament is holding out Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to us as models of our faith, and yet they didn't share in our faith, they weren't saved in the same way or weren't part of the same covenant, that doesn't really make sense. And so he'll kind of go through those relationships. He'll talk about the role of children, their place in the covenant of grace, and say, again, there's a continuity there, that just as there was that privilege that they had in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, of being part of God's people, the same applies today. He's interacting as well with those who would say, well, the difference between Old and New Covenant is that in the Old Covenant, it was all external and physical things, circumcision in the land, and in the New Covenant, it's about the spiritual, eternal things. And he says, no, that's not true, because you go back to the Old Covenant, you go back to what Jeremiah says, or what the psalmists will talk about, and it shows that what God was always after was the heart. What he was always after was the spiritual faith and spiritual relationship that was there. And so again, he's interacting with a lot of the kind of questions that will still pop up today. He goes through a number of texts that people wrestle with when they're trying to understand the relationship of Old and New Covenant, whether it's from Galatians or from Hebrews or others of Paul's epistles, and shows again, makes the argument, these are united, these are the same. Importantly, and I think helpfully, he talks about how you can read certain passages in the New Testament, especially from Hebrews, that will draw a very strong contrast between old and new. And so sometimes people can say, okay, well, this clearly can't be the same thing, right? There's this old thing and this new thing. The old has passed away, the new is here, so there must be a big difference. And Bullinger says, yes, there is a difference, but the difference, he argues, when we talk about old and new, is not a difference in substance or essence. It's a difference in accidents or administration, if we want to kind of use those categories. In other words, it's not that God was doing one thing with Abraham and then he's doing something totally different in the new covenant through Christ, but rather that the ceremonial aspects, the sacrificial aspects, again, all the things that Hebrews spends a lot of time talking about, those are things that are not essential to the covenant. Those aren't talking about the substance of the covenant. Those are shadows and types attached to it that pass away. That's what's old, and what's in the new is really renewed. It's the fulfillment and the furthering of what was already taking place with Abraham, and is finding its consummation in the person and work of Christ. And so he talks about, again, a number of those passages, questions and concerns. He talks about how the Mosaic law, and specifically the ceremonial and sacrificial elements, fit into the flow and unfolding of covenant theology. And then he ends really by making the argument He very briefly touches on the sacrament, but doesn't say much, and says, hey, I've talked about those other places, so you can go there. So doesn't get into all the questions you might have about that, although he articulates something that's very much in line with later Reformed views, which is that the sacrament of circumcision is replaced with baptism. The sacrificial system, including the Passover, is replaced with the Lord's Supper. These function in the same way, but change as consummation has taken place, right? And then he ends with an epilogue, which might feel a little out of place, but what he does is he has a couple of quotes from Eusebius of Caesarea, the great historian of the early church, where Eusebius is making the argument, these pagans accuse us of being kind of a religion of yesterday, when really he's arguing Christianity is the oldest religion in the world. It's the same faith going back, not just to the apostles, not just to Jesus, but to the Old Testament, to Abraham, to Moses, and even to Adam himself, back to the creation of the world. And Bullinger makes the same argument and says that's the faith that we're part of, that's the faith that we're teaching. And he gets polemical at this point and says, really, the Catholics want to accuse us of being this new religion, and they talk as if they're this ancient faith, but really, their antiquity goes back to the first popes in the 7th century, and they're the new kids on the block, Bullinger is saying. Really, our faith is that ancient faith that we find going all the way back to Adam. And so he's, ending with this kind of rousing call to be part of the Protestant Reformation. There are so many wonderful sections in here and quotes. Again, looking at this on my tablet, I don't feel like I can pull them up quickly enough to share them with you. But it's a short work, 40 pages. It's digestible, surprisingly easy to read, and very helpful. Although, again, there are certain things that he either leaves out or just doesn't aren't on his radar screen, and so it's not going to give you a full, explanation of covenant theology. But it's a really good place to go if you're trying to dig into these things further and see how the reformers, as they're formulating some of these things that had been talked about in the early church and developing new categories, and really, I think one of the things that I appreciated is that Bullinger talks about how, doctrinally speaking, he says, all of our faith, the point of all of our faith is found in these covenants, this covenant relationship, these promises that God has given and made. It's the substance of our faith. So it's really important theologically. And then he also kind of talks exegetically, biblically, about how all of Scripture ends up pointing to covenant, like a target, he says. You just keep going back. You keep going back to covenant theology. It's that framework or that paradigm by which we can read the Scriptures that, again, we're not imposing on the Scriptures, Bullinger would say, but it's arising from the Scripture itself. It's the glasses that the Bible gives us to read the Bible. And that's Bullinger's argument. And I think he's right in that. So I would encourage anyone who wants to read the Bible better, anyone who wants to understand what the Reformed Church has taught about this or is interested in historical theology, to sit down and take an hour and read through Bullinger's brief exposition of the one eternal covenant of God.